It is tempting to think of the Indian Constitution as a document drafted entirely from scratch by the Constituent Assembly in 1946, but the foundational framework of Indian governance was an evolutionary byproduct. It was forged through a series of desperate attempts by the British Crown to regulate a rogue transcontinental monopoly, the East India Company. Between a simple trading license issued in 1600 and a sweeping Oversight Act in 1784, a merchant fleet transformed into a complex, fractured proto-state. To understand the architecture of the modern Indian state, we first have to examine the specific corporate crises that forced its DNA into existence. We begin in the year 1600. The East India Company operates purely as a commercial enterprise, functioning under a 15-year monopoly charter granted by Queen Elizabeth I. Look at this initial corporate governance structure. Authority flows from the Crown down to the proprietors, who elect 24 directors. Those directors in Lungan manage the governors stationed across India, in Bombay, Madras, and Bengal. By the 1726 Charter Act, they grant local lawmaking powers to these governors, creating a heavily decentralized framework. This map illustrates the turning point that occurs in 1765. Following the Battle of Buxar, the company acquires Diwani rights. This means they secure the absolute legal authority to collect revenue and taxes across the enormous territories of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. To manage this influx, Robert Clive installs a dual system in Bengal. The company takes control of the money, the revenue collection, while leaving the local nawabs responsible for the expensive, tedious work of maintaining law and order. This exact moment creates an acute structural crisis. A corporation designed strictly to move spices and textiles is now functioning as a sovereign tax-collecting government, lacking the bureaucratic oversight to manage a nation. Unsupervised access to an entire nation's tax base goes exactly how you might expect. Company employees engage in massive private trade and bribery, returning to England as staggeringly wealthy nabobs, while the East India Company sinks into heavy debt. The paradox of bankrupting a monopoly while its middle managers buy English country estates forces the company's hand. They have to beg the British government for a bailout loan, which triggers an immediate investigation by Prime Minister Lord North's secret committee. The Crown steps in with the Regulating Act of 1773. The immediate triage is straightforward. It strictly prohibits officials from private trade or accepting bribery. The primary shift is structural. The act elevates the Bengal governor to governor general, explicitly subordinating Bombay and Madras underneath his command. To check his power, a 4-member executive council is created to enforce and draft rules. Finally, a Supreme Court is established in Calcutta to penalize corrupt officials. Finally, the act implements strict oversight in London. The Court of Directors is legally mandated to report all incoming revenues directly to the British ministries. The 1773 Regulating Act is the first definitive step toward a centralized executive branch in India. It permanently alters the East India Company from an independent private firm into a regulated apparatus of the state. The 1773 Act had a critical flaw. It created an executive branch for tax collection and a judicial branch to enforce the law, but completely failed to define their jurisdictional boundaries. Predictably, the Governor-General and the Supreme Court ended up in constant, paralyzing clashes. This forced Parliament to pass the 1781 Settlement Act. It formally immunized the Governor-General and his Executive Council from Supreme Court jurisdiction for official acts. The Act also clarified the appellate structure. Appeals from local provincial courts would now route directly up to the Governor-General, explicitly bypassing the Supreme Court entirely. The Supreme Court's mandate was refined to focus on the local population, instructed to administer justice according to Hindu and Muslim laws, weaving customs into the colonial framework. This 1781 separation established concepts that remain foundational today, defining the limits of judicial review and establishing executive immunity for official actions of the state. By this point, authority in India was organized, but a severe administrative problem lingered in London. The Court of Directors were highly skilled merchants, but they were entirely incapable of managing large-scale military strategy and political expansion. Prime Minister William Pitt recognized this and introduced Pitt's India Act of 1784. His radical solution was the creation of a parallel oversight body, the Board of Control, 6 members appointed by the Crown. Look at how power divides. The Board of Control takes command of political and military affairs, while the Court of Directors is restricted solely to commercial trade. This structural setup installs a dual government. It marks the exact moment the British state formally annexes the political operations of the East India Company, leaving only the corporate shell behind. Translating this 1784 chart into modern political science terms reveals its structural lineage. The Governor-General functions as the executive. The Council serves as the legislature. The Calcutta Court is an independent judiciary, and the board acts as state oversight. The legislation passed between 1773 and 1784 were not random royal decrees. They formed a rigorous, logical chain of responses designed to fix specific instances of corruption and corporate overreach. This dual system of governance laid an unbreakable bedrock that eventually supported absolute British Crown rule in 1858. And when India finally gained its independence, it was this exact administrative skeleton upon which the modern constitution was built.